Good evening, everybody. We're just going to give folks a couple more minutes to join, and then we'll get started with tonight's discussion. Thanks. Right. Thank you for joining, everybody. My name is Sven Biggs, and I am the Canadian Oil and Gas Program Director at Stand.earth. Thanks for joining us for this important conversation tonight. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the unceded territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people. But I think we'd be remiss if we didn't also acknowledge the territories of the Blueberry River, Dogue River, Fort Nelson, Hathaway River, McLeod Lake, Prophet River, Soto, and West Moberly First Nations. Collectively, they make up what are sometimes referred to as BC's Treaty 8 First Nations, and all the fracking that goes on in our province happens in their traditional territory. In fact, the BC Supreme Court ruled in 2021 that the fracking operations and the other industrial activity that happens on their territories violates Treaty 8. And we're going to talk a little bit later in the evening about some of the ramifications of that landmark court case. When we started looking into this issue of fracking and water in particular, we put together a report called Fracking with Freshwater that was released in December. We found some really some really astonishing findings that we think are kind of the basis of tonight's discussion. One of the things we discovered is that the oil and gas industry here in BC is the only industry that's permitted to extract fresh water, contaminate it, and then dispose of it without treating it in a manner that removes it permanently from the water cycle. We also learned that fracking creates enormous amount of wastewater, which causes serious harm to people in the environment. In BC, wastewater is currently all disposed of untreated and what the industry calls disposal wells that have serious environmental ramifications. There is basically no way to conduct fracking without poisoning huge amounts of water, and there's no way to dispose of that wastewater without putting communities and the environment at risk. Perhaps most alarmingly, we learned that if the 5 proposed LNG terminals in this province go ahead, the amount of fracking, and by extension, the amount of water used in fracking would need to double. And that would mean about 10.4 billion liters of water a year used by the fracking industry. Historically, the oil and gas industry has used relatively little water compared to other industrial users in the province, but that changed dramatically in 2005 when fracking was introduced. Unfortunately, the laws and regulations around water use in oil and gas haven't changed to keep up with that shift in the way water is being used. So those are kind of some of the baseline facts that I think inform tonight's discussion. And now I would like to introduce our panel of experts. We'll go deeper into all of those issues. So we're very fortunate tonight to be joined by three of the leading experts in our province on this issue. Ben Parfit comes to us from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, where he has written extensively on this issue, and is one of the leading experts in this field. Donna Forsyth is a former legislative advisor to the BC Ministry of the Environment and Climate Change Strategies, and she helped draft the Water Sustainability Act. She's going to talk to us a little bit tonight about how little fracking companies pay to access water, and in some cases how they actually get it for free, and how that's a hidden fossil fuel subsidy. And finally, Dr. Jill Wendling is going to speak to us. He's a hydrologist and has a PhD from a University of Montreal. He's going to talk to us about well integrity and what kind of risks that poses to water in British Columbia. So we are going to start tonight by hearing from Ben. Ben, I pass it over to you.
Hey, thank you very much, Sven. In particular, thanks for organizing tonight's webinar and for the report that you produced in December, which is a great report. It really highlights some of the significant challenges that we face in this province as the fracking industry expands in an environment of very lax regulation. And I think you and Stand have done a terrific job in drilling down into some of the core issues that need to be addressed and the reforms that need to occur. So with that, I'm just going to share my screen, fingers crossed. I hope that's there. Just need to go to So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening in terms of fracking activities on the landscape, but largely through the lens of what's happening in Blueberry River First Nations territory. As Sven outlined at the beginning, the threats posed by the fracking industry and water use in Northeast British Columbia are particularly profound for First Nations living in the region, all of whom are signatories to a historic treaty, Treaty 8. These particular threats are going to become, without question, more pronounced in the next couple of years as the Coastal GasLink pipeline is built and as the door opens for the fracking industry to dramatically increase gas drilling and fracking activities in support of liquefied natural gas production in the province. All of British Columbia's fracked methane gas comes from Northeast BC, as Sven explained, which is covered by Treaty 8, a document signed more than 120 years ago by several First Nations. In a landmark decision by the Supreme Court of British Columbia 2 years ago, the court found that the treaty-protected rights of one of those nations, the Blueberry River First Nations, had been violated because the cumulative effect of decades and decades of resource industry developments had severely compromised the ability of the nation's members to hunt, fish, and trap. The provincial government which gave the green light to all of those industrial developments, could have challenged that decision, but it elected not to. And in my view, it didn't really have a choice. The court's ruling was absolutely scathing about the disregard that key provincial agencies, such as the Oil and Gas Commission, had shown when it came to considering how multiple industrial developments amounted to a gross violation of the nation's treaty rights. After more than a year and a half of negotiations, Premier David Eby and Blueberry River First Nations Chief Judy Desjardins signed an agreement last month that will govern how resource industry activities proceed on the nation's already horrifically fractured traditional lands. The agreement has not been made public, however, by either the nation or the provincial government. But we do know one thing, and that is that a key component of the agreement is that future industrial activities will, as much as possible, occur on lands that are already disturbed. And this effectively means that the door is thrown wide open to fracking activities for decades to come in the territory. Since we're here tonight to talk about fracking, I'm not going to talk about the considerable losses Blueberry River First Nations have suffered from industrial logging, major hydroelectric dams, and mining activities in its territory. This particular map shows you just the extent of oil and gas wells and related facilities in the territory at the time that the nation launched its case in 2015. The result of all these developments, plus all the other industrial activities in the territory, is that today, in more than 80% of the territory, you are never further away from an industrial disturbance than 250 meters. And in 90% of the territory, you're never further away than 500 meters from one industrial development or another. With almost all of Blueberry's territory already disturbed, it is clear that the agreement reached between Blueberry and the provincial government leaves the door effectively wide open to fracking activities for decades to come. Today's fracking activities all take place on very large pads known as multi-well pads, which are spread over many acres. Each of these pads are slated to have 20 or more gas wells situated on them. Each one of those wells will then be fracked, a process that will require huge volumes of water and generate equally huge quantities of toxic wastewater as well. This slide gives you a sense of two things. It shows approvals issued to two of the major companies operating in Blueberry territory, Tourmaline and Petronas. Petronas, it should be stressed, is a senior partner, second only to Shell, in the massive Canada LNG plant now under construction. These bar graphs show multi-well pad approvals for both companies. And as you can see, there is a staggering number of well pad approvals in 2 years for each of the companies. Those significant spikes both occurred after the Blueberry River First Nations launched their court case and before the court issued its historic ruling 7 years later. To give you a sense of what you're looking at here, just the approvals for those 2 years alone translate into the green light for Tourmaline and Petronas fracking a combined 4,500 new methane gas wells. This slide gives you a sense of how Petronas and other companies are rapidly increasing the volume of water they use in their fracking operations. Year over year, the amount of water being pressure pumped underground on Treaty 8 lands is growing. What this slide shows is that between 2012 and 2019, water use on the average fracked well increased threefold to reach more than 22,000 cubic meters of water per well. To give some perspective, this is about the equivalent of 9 Olympic swimming pools of water for each fracked well. Those increases that I just explained likely signal further increases ahead. And why is that? It's largely because the length of the horizontal well bores that are being drilled today are getting longer with each year. And as those well bores drive further into shale rock, the number of discrete fracking stages increases. And as those stages increase, of course, that means that more water must be used as well. According to Alan Chapman, a former chief water scientist with the BC Oil and Gas Commission, which, by the way, is now to be known as the BC Energy Regulator, 6 companies, including Petronas and Tourmaline, all used in recent years more than 30,000 cubic meters of water at some of their fracked wells. And we know from the data that Chapman analyzed that one of those companies, ConocoPhillips, used a staggering 83,000 cubic meters of water on average for each of the wells that it fracked in 2019. Another important thing to remember is that the size of the multi-well pads is growing, and that means more wells per pad. There is one well that I was on near Dawson Creek a few years ago that had been built by Ovintiv on agricultural land, big enough to hold 56 drilled and fracked wells. This quote comes from Iswan Ismail. He's with Petronas, and he made the comment following the announcement of the agreement signed between the Blueberry River First Nations and the provincial government. It is hard to gauge in his words just how much necessary work is going to translate into increased water use by Petronas and other companies. But just on the existing well pads alone in Treaty 8 territory, there is currently 10,000 more gas wells that can be situated just on the existing multi-well pads. Based on average water use, we're looking at 230 million cubic meters of water that is going to be needed to frack those wells, which is equivalent to roughly 100,000 Olympic swimming pools. And I think it's safe to assume the number could be a lot higher because we do not know, for example, whether ConocoPhillips is going to continue to be an outlier or whether its water use is going to come to be matched by companies operating in Blueberry territory. Lastly, I want to end by saying that the use of water is also translating into other significant footprints on the land base in Blueberry territory and in the territory of other Treaty 8 First Nations. The sheer amount of water that needs to be harnessed in these fracking operations led Petronas and another number of other companies operating in the Montney region to build several dozen, in fact, dams, which were built without permits to store fresh water used in the fracking process. Close to 100 of these structures were built, again without permits, on public and private lands in Northeast British Columbia. With 24 of those facilities, most of them owned by Petronas, capable of holding 70,000 to 200,000 cubic meters of fresh water each. The largest of the dams built without permits by Petronas was as tall as a 7-story apartment building and was built on Blueberry lands in violation not only of provincial dam safety regulations, but also in violation of the Provincial Environmental Assessment Act. And I will close by saying that for violating both those regulations and the Environmental Assessment Act, the company was never prosecuted for its actions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Donna, who I've had the pleasure of working with on groundwater issues. Donna, over to you.
Thanks, Ben. I think you have to mute yourself now. Oh, you have to unshare. Okay, now it should go to me. Is it happening? Okay, I'm just going to go ahead because I had, what? Now it's not working. There we go. Okay. Try that again.
We could see your screen, but not the PowerPoint was in
No.
the tab.
Okay.
Donna, you're just on mute.
I didn't push. That work? Are we there now with the mic?
Yes, and your slides.
Sorry about, okay. I want to acknowledge that I am speaking from the unceded territory of the Lekwungen peoples and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanic peoples in what is known as Victoria. So my presentation today is about highlighting legislative provisions that set up hidden subsidies, I would call them. They're not necessarily obvious unless you know how to connect all the dots. And some of those involve access to water, and some of them involve exemptions from water protection regulations. The focus will be mainly on the access to water, but they're both important subsidies, I would say. So as Ben alluded to, the new BC energy regulator came into being in November. There was an amendment to legislation, and there was also an expansion of their authority to cover both carbon capture and hydrogen fuel, which we're not going to necessarily get in today, but that's just sort of flagging that for everybody. The legislation retains the industry funding, so that potential conflict of interest where industry is basically paying the salaries of staff and has a lot of string pulling going on, I would say. Some refer to that as fox guarding the hen house. We also have the retention of what I'm calling hidden subsidies. So some of that is the fast tracking of permits where oil and gas, BC energy regulator staff get authority under different legislation packages to authorize the permits as a streamlined one-stop shop. And of course, there's cost savings in that. But we're really here to talk about water and free, both cheap, free, and unregulated private sales of water are what I'm going to focus mainly on, as well as those other exemptions. So the first and only water that is paid for and reported on and under regulation is water under a water license. Again, those authorization authorities are given to OGC staff now, the energy regulator. And in this case, it's through an MOU, which is not transparent. It's not in the legislation, but I know about it because of the work I did. But then the real point that I would like to make is that the water rentals are comparable to other industrial water users. And as I think was Sven highlighted, those other industries treat their water and return it to the hydrological cycle. and fracking operations don't have to do that. So they're basically allowed to permanently destroy it and remove it from the cycle. The BC energy regulator and the fracking industry would frame this as protecting the environment, because they're not allowing produced water to be discharged to the surface. And this is a historical sort of, it comes from the conventional oil and gas production, which was just drilling a hole in the ground and pumping out the oil and gas. And water would come as a byproduct of that. And it was pretty crappy water, and it was put back underground. It had never been usable above ground. So it's a very different class of water than what we've got now, which is fracking wastewater, drawn from the surface and very available, and then pushed underground to frack the rock. So again, this cost of water reflecting a completely different type of use and destruction is a huge cost saving. And there's basically future risks that future generations will have to bear. Then we have free water. The first category of free water is under use approvals. So again, another fast-tracked permit that is given to oil and gas. Sorry, I'm having trouble with the conversion. The BC, I'll just call them the energy regulator staff. So cost savings in that, but also other industries that use approvals pay for water based on a water license fee. And they treat the water and they have those additional costs, and they return it to the hydrological cycle. So instead, fracking operations are exempt from paying these fees, and they're entitled to, there's no limit on what this approval can authorize in terms of volume. And again, they're destroying it and removing it. There's also an issue with the fact that these are called a short-term approval. They max out at 24 months, but there's a standard practice of renewing them, and now authority in the legislation to renew them multiple times because of a court case. And the only limitation is that there can't be water held back by a dam. So again, free. Second category of free is free deep groundwater. And this is found under Part 5 of the Water Sustainability Regulation. When it was originally proposed, there was a salinity attached to this free water, but that didn't stick. So we have free water with no licensing or approval requirement, no limit on the volume, no consultation with Indigenous peoples or other users that might be impacted, and no requirement to really assess connectivity or impacts. They self-report the depth of the well, and if it's below a geological marker, which is called the fish scales marker, which is basically recognizable as they drill through the ground, and at least 300 meters, which isn't really deep, that's the only requirement. They don't have to measure salinity. They don't have to monitor. And this is very different from Alberta, where Alberta, there's no requirement to have a license, but it has to be 4,000 total dissolved solids at least in order to get that exemption. So in our case, the lack of monitoring would also reflect that there's, when they don't have to monitor a change in salinity, that lack of monitoring eliminates the possibility of establishing that they're drawing from another less saline aquifer, which would show impacts. And in addition, they used to be covered with an environmental assessment. These big wells, they're pumping at more than 75 liters a second. If they had been, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought a little bit. So initially, an environmental assessment would have been required for these types of wells, which are going to be large. If you're drilling that deep, they're going to it'd be expensive unless and so you're going to have a big well. The environmental assessment processes now doesn't cover wells if they're exempt as one of these deep groundwater wells under the Water Sustainability Act. So no assessment of the environmental impacts of these wells at all. And the burden of proof to prove any impacts would be on somebody who is complaining. So a costly process for individuals or other users. The other main category of water is private water sales of unvested water. And I'm calling this the Wild West because this water is unregulated and unreported, as far as I'm aware. So in the WSA, there's a section that vests water in the Crown, and it includes stream water and groundwater, but it doesn't include water that you could capture before it enters a stream, generally known as snowmelt or overland flow. And this water's unvested and the provincial laws don't apply. So we've got potentially thousands of dugouts, maybe even more, popping up all over in the Northeast, private water sales from water that's collected in these dugouts. They're considered maybe a mix of vested and unvested water, but there's no oversight, consultation, or protection when the water is unvested. And then there's also just a flag again of an issue of future bulk water transports out of BC, because this unvested water would not fall under the Water Protection Act ban. And the collection and transport systems are ready to roll in the Northeast. So then the other sort of category of hidden subsidies for the fossil fuel industry is exemption from water protection regs. We've talked about them not having to treat the water, but we also have a new amendment that came through, was passed in 2020, actually came into effect in 21, where the oil and gas regulator will now set all the standards for cleanup of any spill or contaminated sites, and they set the standards assessing risks for monitoring the underground disposal wells, the containment of that toxic waste, and well integrity, which I understand Dr. Welding will get into a little bit. Sorry. There's also, what happened there? Sorry, am I in the right place? Yes. Okay. So I already talked about the exemption that was received, and this is just sort of clarifying exactly what's meant by that. And I'm kind of running out of time, so I will just note that I also included the dam exemption that Ben talked about, where retroactive exemptions were granted for unauthorized dams. And, there was no review of the actual design or construction. Who knows what degree of risk there is out there, but as the increase in earthquakes happens, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to think there's even more risk that there will be problems with those dams, even if they were built properly. The final hidden subsidy is it's a little tricky to describe, but I'll do my best. Both streamlining for change approvals, which it's change in and about a stream, which is basically roads, bridges, pipelines, all cross water sources, which are streams. And basically there's a whole approval process that would go through following the WSA, but there also is an exemption where if there's standards under the oil and gas legislation they don't have to use the WSA change approvals at all. And so basically they have their own unique construction standards that are vetted by industry. So just to wrap up, basically we've got an continuation of the industry funded regulator, and adding hydrogen fuel and carbon capture to their authorities. Really, there shouldn't be any hidden subsidies at this point in our energy development, and I would argue all of them should be removed. But in the meantime, at least we should have complete some transparency and clarity around what volumes are involved in all these different potential sources of water. And as we noted in the introduction by Sven, toxic wastewater is hazardous waste and should be under AMA with mandatory treatment, recycling, and ultimately return it to the hydrological cycle. And we should be banning disposal by injection underground, which also creates increased earthquake risk, as far as I'm aware. And finally, we're in the process, the government is in the process of a watershed security strategy, which is kind of the new water plan. And in the course of that, there should definitely be closing the jurisdictional gap created by having unvested, unregulated water. That would stop the private water sales, or at least change them, and eliminate the risk of bulk water transport out of BC. And with that, I am going to do my best to get back. Did that work?
You have to hit the red stop share button.
Ah, there it is. Okay. Sorry, thanks. Oh, sorry. I'm supposed to introduce Dr. Jill Wedding as the next speaker.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining this panel. It's this very important and interesting discussion and conversation on water protection. So my focus is going to be the issue of loss of well integrity and how it affects water and watersheds. So what is well integrity? Well integrity refers to the degree in which a well is sealed to prevent leakage of fluids such as gas from depth. And as John Cherry was kind of a grandfather of hydrogeology in Canada, mentioned in a presentation in 2014, he said that well integrity is likely the most important shale gas issue because groundwater is getting contaminated and there is a release of greenhouse gases. How does that happen? That wells are deep holes that go 1.5, 2 kilometers, 2.5 kilometers, depending on the region in North America. And they intersect different zones in the subsurface. Some zone close to the surface mostly contain fresh water. And as you go deeper, the quality of the water drops because you are dealing with older and older water. And as you go deeper, you get into saline water and water loaded with heavy metals. And the pressure is very high at depth. So therefore, there is a movement upwards. And if a well loses its seal and become a pathway, then it can put in contact fluid at depth of poor quality in contact with good quality water at surface. And if we have gases in that mix, those gases will diffuse to the surface and discharge to the atmosphere. It has been recognized by the industry. So wells are made of steel and concrete. So you have a telescopic system with various diameters. You start with a large diameter surface and you reduce the diameter as you go down. And in the annulus between the steel, you inject concrete in order to as much as possible, have a sealed system. However, over years, the casing will degrade. In the subsurface, we're dealing with a very aggressive geochemical environment. And so the steel will degrade, will pit, and then also the cement will degrade. And this is illustrated on the right here, where you can see part of the annulus has lost its integrity. It's not sealed anymore. So we have wells which go deep and tap into gas formations. All formations also contain water. So it's why you have return water when you operate a gas well. And so with loss of well integrity, you can have loss of fluids within the structure of the well. But unfortunately, you can also have loss of well integrity at the periphery and outside of the well. So you can, to a certain extent, deal with the resealing of the well on a regular basis. But for everything which happens outside of the well, it's game over. You can't control that. How are shallow aquifers, spring and surface water impacted? They are impacted if they can be put in contact. So this is a case I worked on in the piece near the Pine River. And this is a zone where we had a marsh at surface and we had the property relying on springs for their cattle. And through the study, we really were able to illustrate the various horizons that you encounter as you go down. So here we are, about 2 kilometers down. And some of those formations mostly contain gas, like the Montney, but other, like the Halfway and the Baldano, they are mostly aquifers. They contain water, but water is very saline water. So I have at scale here the well with the vertical section of the well and the horizontal section in order to optimize the contact with the shale clay. And so there is a source of potential contamination, as I mentioned, with the poor quality fluids and with the methane and with the gases. The driver will be due to the pressure. It's very hot down there. Typically for gas wells in North America, it's between 80 degrees and 140 degrees. So you have extremely high pressure to this high temperature. And that creates a gradient upwards. The fluid will move upwards. And as I mentioned, if the wells start to lose their integrity, then they become pathways for those poor quality fluids. So it will affect the zone immediately around the well. As you can see here in this illustration, you have the aquifer at proximity from the well, but groundwater moves in aquifers over long distances. And as you can see here in my illustration, and those aquifers are connected to rivers, and they are very important because they provide the base flow to rivers. So any degradation of the water quality in the aquifers will end up degrading the water quality in the rivers. Is this happening? The NORWAL in 2020 published the results of some research they had done, and mentioning that about 10% of the wells leak. So for me, it's any given time, 10% of wells leak. But you can imagine that you need to put time into perspective. And a well that may not leak today, in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, may become a leaky well. So time is very important. Why is it so important? Because of the numbers of wells. Approximately close to 800,000 wells in Canada, about 6 million wells in North America. That's a lot of wells. It's a lot of well in the ground. And a well is a hole drilled in the ground. And when you drill a hole, it's forever. You can't put the reset button and say, okay, I want to remove that well at that location. The hole is done. Then we spend money and try to fix sites and wells which have lost their integrity. The narwhal again mentioned that it costs an average $370,000 to fix a well. That's one time, one well. If this well needs to be fixed again 20 years, 50 years from now, it will be another 300, 400, 500. Do we have the money? This map shows the companies that filed for bankruptcy in 2020 in North America. If we add up all the regions here, we have over 100,000 wells that don't have any owner anymore. Or they may have owners, but the owners said they don't have any money. Sorry. Is it a big problem? In Alberta, it was estimated, according to an article by the CBC, that the cost of dealing with leaky wells would be between $30 billion and $70 billion today. How much money do we have in bank? About 200 million in security. That's 1%. Who is going to release and provide the other 99%? There's a good chance it's going to be you and my kids and my grandkids. Solutions. We need to take the problem seriously. We need to talk about it. And I think it's still very hush-hush. I mean, it's not really, it doesn't make the headlines of media. And the industry is not interested that it makes the headlines. So we need, for any new wells, to have adequate bonding in place. We need to force the oil and gas industry to actually pay for their damage and their legacy. We also need to much better understand what's happening below 300 meters, what's called the intermediate zone, between 300 and 900 meters. Because right now, it's like a no man's land. We can put everything down there and nobody will see it. We need to understand, because what happens at 500 meters may 20 years later, 50 years later, happen at 30 meters. Also, I believe that right now we still have access to fresh water, but in 50 years or 100 years from now, there will be less access to water. And maybe we'll be interested to have access to water at 500 meters, 600, and 900 meters. And we don't want that water to be contaminated by previous activities from the oil and gas. I will finish on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Gilles. I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the solutions to these policies. But before we do that, we've got a poll we'd like to ask you all after you've heard some of these presentations. What concerns you about fracking? All right, there's a poll. Just give you a second to fill it out. Also, I encourage folks, if you have questions about anything you've heard tonight or about this topic in general, to use the Q&A tab or the chat to pose those questions to our panelists, and we'll get to them in just a couple of minutes. All right. Just giving everybody a second to vote in the poll. All right. Well, let's start talking about some of the solutions. Have the results of the poll select. There we go. All of the above one. Wow. Very interesting. All right. So solutions. So the first one is to treat fracking waste as hazardous waste. We recommend right now all wastewater from fracking in BC basically is pumped down what are called disposal wells. And disposal wells are just old oil and gas wells that are no longer in use and have been repurposed for disposal of this wastewater. So what we're suggesting is that that water should, instead of going straight down those wells, should go to industrial waste treatment centers where the contaminants in them, they have heavy metals, sometimes naturally occurring radioactive material, benzenes and other carcinogens. There are processes that can remove them. They're expensive and energy intensive often, but this would reduce the amount of waste that is going straight down these disposal wells. It would also reduce potentially the amount of fresh water that's being used in fracking. Right now, a lot of that wastewater can't be reused because it would run the risk of fouling the wells. By removing the contaminants, a lot of that water can be reused in the process. So we see that as step one. The second one is protecting groundwater aquifers. Right now, there is neither baseline testing around disposal wells or ongoing testing. So we don't know whether these wells are leaking because we're not even looking. So this kind of ongoing testing is something that needs to be done. Solution 3 is putting the water stewardship branch back in charge of access to water for oil and gas. This is the only industry in our province that has kind of a one-stop regulator that they can get all their permits for, including their access to water. And putting all water licensing back in the hands of one office at the Ministry of the Environment, we think will improve the transparency and hopefully improve enforcement around issues of water and oil and gas. And finally, we think, as you heard from Donna tonight, water is either cheap or free for this industry. And that means there's really no incentive for them to conserve water. So putting a price on water that would encourage conservation, we see as one of the key steps that needs to happen. We've actually created an easy online tool that will allow you to write to the relevant ministers and the provincial government and ask them to implement these changes. And I think it's going to be shared in the chat, so you can just click on that link and go away quickly and fill that out, or wait until after tonight's discussion and do that then. I guess when we're talking about solutions with fracking, though, we're kind of not dealing with the elephant in the room, and that's there really is no safe way for communities or the climate to operate on to do fracking. It simply creates too much poisonous waste, releases too much methane into the atmosphere, and there isn't a safe way to do it. So the long-term solution has to be to phase out fracking in this province. And the kind of solutions we talked about are great interim measures that will help reduce the impact of the industry and make it safer. But in the end, we need to deal with this industry and find a way to phase it out. So Stand and our partners at the Dogwood Initiative and the Wilderness Committee have launched a new joint campaign that we're calling Frack Free BC. We launched in December with an action at the cabinet swearing in for the new provincial government. You can see some of the folks that took part in that here. And we have a series of actions going on all year long that we plan to help raise the pressure on this issue and make it an election issue in the next provincial election. The next ones are coming up on March 26th and 27th. And we have a call next week to talk about how to get involved in Frack Free BC and how to take part in these actions. The links are also going to be posted in the chat, but here is how you can find those actions and get involved. With that, we are going to move to the Q&A portion of tonight. So I've got a couple of questions here that were in the chat, and in the Q&A section, folks can keep adding those if you want to. Let's start with Jill. We've heard a couple of people mention tonight that there's a connection between fracking and earthquakes. Can you explain to us what the link is?
I'd be happy to start. The link is associated with the tremendous pressure at which the water, the sand, and the chemicals are pumped underground during the fracking process. The more often that occurs, the more frequently earthquakes occur. The more often it occurs, the more likelihood there is of stronger earthquakes occurring. The earthquakes are also associated, as Donna mentioned, with disposal well operations. Again, in order to dispose of liquids underground, you have to pressure pump them at extreme pressures. Very, very high correlation of earthquakes to fracking activities in parts of the world which did not have high numbers of earthquakes to begin with. So a number of states in the United States where fracking activity has escalated in the last 20 years and where earthquakes were not occurring frequently are occurring. We've had earthquakes in British Columbia and Alberta that have been in the mid-4 range. Significant earthquakes felt over 100 kilometers away from their epicenters, and all of this is linked to the water pumping and the pressure being exerted. I don't know, Gilles, whether you would like to comment on how that might impact in terms of water movement and groundwater contamination?
Thanks to you, Ben. I think you covered it well. I think it's due to the very high pressure. We have like columns of water, if you want to put an equivalent, almost like 5 kilometers of water column apply in order to frack. So it's a very high pressure. And yes, disposal of the liquid waste in old and deep wells is also a source of earthquakes. And it has been known and recorded that some of the earthquakes actually fragilize and damage wells. So there again, there is another element which goes toward the loss of well integrity of wells just because of the shaking and the disruption at depth. And yes, comparing what happened, 50 years, 100 years from now to now, it's quite easy now to track the location of earthquake, their depth, and so it's quite easy to relate the trigger of earthquakes following a series of fracking event, for example. You can really put it in the calendar and say, okay, it happened for a reason, and it's due to the fracking and due to the injection. Thank you.
Yeah, I would also quickly just add, for those people that are interested, highly recommend just Googling Andrew Nikiforic's name. He's reported extensively on earthquakes and triggered by fracking, and Alan Chapman, who was a chief water scientist with the Oil and Gas Commission. If you search under his name and earthquakes, you'll turn up a very interesting journal article that looks at fracking activities in Northeast British Columbia and the prospect for increased frequency and severity of earthquakes.
Thank you. I see Nelson asks in the Q&A, isn't the root cause of fracking the approval of so much LNG capacity in BC? I guess I'll start with that. I mean, I think the first thing to know about LNG in BC is right now there aren't any major LNG terminals up and running. There's one major one in Kitimat, the first phase of LNG Canada, that is under construction. But the other projects have yet to start yet. Now, if all of those projects go ahead, and especially phase 2 of LNG Canada, which is I think the largest proposal out there, it would mean that we would need about double the gas we're extracting in British Columbia now, maybe slightly more. And that would require a huge expansion in the number of wells in northeastern British Columbia. Right now, most of the gas we extract in BC goes to Alberta, and some of it is exported to the United States. In Alberta, it's used in the tar sands, especially what's called in situ projects, where they heat up the ground to melt tar sands and pump it to the surface. But very little of the gas is used here in the province. Somewhere around 17% of the gas we extract in BC is used here. Did anyone else want to jump in on that question?
Yes, what something that I wanted to add to the conversation is that frack wells, they have a lifespan. From the day they start operating, their pressure drops and their production will drop. And typically a well will be productive 3 to 5 years. And then it needs to be replaced. Another well needs to take its place in order to keep the production going. And also the industry have started targeting the most, where the return with the highest, where the pressures were the highest. So I feel now that the good spots have been taken. So now we'll need, in fact, more wells in order to keep the production. So we are almost like on a treadmill, and the treadmill is going faster and faster. Ben, do you have anything to add? Or Donna?
Okay, I think we'll move on to the next question. I see George in the chat saying, do we have measurements of the increased ill health effects experienced by communities near fracking? There is unfortunately limited research in Canada on the health impacts of fracking. There is a study that was done in northeastern British Columbia that looked at pregnant women in fracking communities and found that there was a measurable increase in certain carcinogens like benzene metabolites in their urine and other samples that were taken from them. There's a similar study that was recently done in Alberta that found similar results, but we know from the United States and where the largest amount of fracking has happened, there are a lot of studies there that show a direct correlation between being in a community where fracking is happening and all sorts of health impacts, everything from cancer to persistent nosebleeds that are caused by this. Anybody else want to jump in on the health impacts question?
No, unfortunately, there are very few studies. There are some teams in Canada who are working on it, and it's still a ground that needs to be described. But it's complex, and just getting reliable data from the population, having a large enough size of population in order to do the hair sampling and the urine sampling, etc. But it's true that overall that in North America, there is a lack of health impact studies, unfortunately.
Now, I guess the one other thing to mention on that is the study in BC did show that the exposure was disproportionately high in Indigenous women. So there is I think a climate justice issue here as well that needs to be expected. Donna, here's a question for you. How would you set a fair price for oil and gas to use water?
Well, as I said, I would stop the authority to inject the wastewater, have them incur the same costs as every other industry in terms of treating their waste and reintroducing the water back into the hydrological cycle. And if that was the case, then the water licensing rentals could be closer to being reasonable. The water can be available for other users after that. But there's still those three other categories of water out there that there's either no charge or and bypassing consultations and other assessment that other industries would have to do, as well as the Wild West private sale issue. So, I guess what really sort of sticks with me is this idea that this industry gets it both ways. They get the water for free, and then they also don't have the costs to treat it that every other industry has. And I guess I'm still sort of recognizing the fact that it's a carryover from history, but it just doesn't make any sense in our time and with what we know now about the risks in terms of the climate and on top of that. So, you could review all industrial users and say they're all paying too little. I think that's another conversation, but I guess I just want to focus on the fact that this is the only industry that gets that sort of double benefit of either free or cheap, and don't bother treating it. Just, get rid of it, pretend it doesn't exist anymore, with the future risk that, as Dr. Welding was saying, that it'll come back to haunt us, and those companies won't be there to, pay to clean it up. It's no different in my mind from nuclear waste in that sense. If we're just shoving it somewhere and pretending it doesn't exist, it's a future risk. I don't think I really answered your question. I got to rant a little bit. Thank you.
Okay, did anybody else want to jump in on this question?
I think I would just make the observation that, some industries like the pulp industry, for example, pay rates that probably are similar to what is paid by the fracking industry. But the pulp industry is using an enormous amount of water more than the fracking industry, and is absorbing all the costs of treating that water, as Donna said. So I think one can make the argument that industrial users that are using large volumes of water, under certain circumstances, it may be justified for them paying a lesser amount, having regard for the costs that they are then going to have to absorb on the treatment side. But the critical thing here is that there is no treatment requirement. And we have a massive amount of wastewater that is building up in these holding facilities. And we know that the pits in particular, where the hazardous wastewater is being stored, do leak and have leaked and have caused groundwater contamination. And I think that is a huge area of concern, because the longer this water stays in these lined pits, the more likely it is that there's going to be a leakage occurring, and that leakage can get into the soil and then from the soil into the groundwater.
Jill, you talked about how wells stop producing gas relatively quickly, fracking wells. Who's responsible for monitoring those wells, especially after they stop producing? And how would we know whether or not they were leaking?
Ben, do you want to take this one?
Well, there is a very significant drop off, as Gilles said, in gas production at fracked wells. A tremendous amount of gas coming out following fracking activities, followed by a very, very steep decline. However, as long as the wells are still producing gas, even if it isn't a marginal amount of gas, that doesn't trigger a requirement to clean up. And where the issue can become critical is that the longer period of time passes, the more of those wells accumulate that are marginal producers, the more likely it is that the companies that drilled those wells are no longer on the scene. And that is where the problem arises. So I think getting back to Gilles' presentation, what I think we desperately need in this province and in other jurisdictions is to see a bonding requirement that ensures that the money is placed up front to do the work to clean up these wells, and we avoid the situation where companies sell off their quote unquote assets to a junior company that doesn't have the resources to clean it up. And we've seen that happening in British Columbia, and we need to be very, very concerned about it. One of the things we haven't talked about today, but I think it's worth reflecting on. There were two significant zones where natural gas was believed to be capable of being produced through fracking and generating huge volumes of gas to put onto the market. One of those basins was the Horn River Basin, which is in the most remote part of northeastern British Columbia. At the time that the fracking boom began, the Horn River was seen as this area that was going to be the source of huge volumes of gas. No sooner did the boom start there than it went bust. The Provincial Oil and Gas Commission has characterized the Horn River Basin as effectively abandoned today. So you've got thousands of abandoned facilities up there, and companies that are effectively drilling and fracking. All of their drilling and fracking has ceased. Some of those assets have been taken over by companies that appear to have very, very few resources. And I think there's huge question marks now hanging over the liabilities associated with those wells. Again, that underscores, I think, the importance of what Gilles was talking about, which is the bonding requirement. And I would add that one other thing that's not talked about a lot in terms of the liability that is out there is that some of these other facilities are going to require an order of magnitude more money to rehabilitate than the gas wells. So if you look at these huge holding sites for hazardous wastewater, those facilities are going to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars each to clean up. And there's no bonding requirement there. So, I think we have to be thinking not just in terms of the wells, but all of the hazardous water facilities, all of the unregulated dams, all of this stuff is going to have to be cleaned up at considerable cost, which should push the bonding requirement even higher, in my view.
And I just want to reiterate that now the regulator, the industry-funded regulator, is setting all the standards for what is considered a cleaned up site, with those standards being vetted by industry effectively. So, what can you do? Well, we'll make the regulation reflect what you can afford versus what should happen. And that's definitely been a pattern over the years is, what can industry accept without supposedly walking and going and developing the resource somewhere else? That was always sort of this vague threat. Similar sort of idea is going to come up in terms of what the actual cleaned up sites really look like in the end of the day. And it, doesn't look very promising from the past history. Scary.
I see Eric asking, is the water used by the oil and gas industry competing with agricultural production? Anybody want to take that?
I would say absolutely. From the perspective of especially the dugouts, they're being constructed on agricultural land, for one thing. So all that water that would have been captured as a stream recharge or a groundwater recharge is now going into being captured in a solid facility that now gets sold off somewhere else. So I was actually just looking at the website and they're reporting, the number of times that they have to shut down use because there's no water. It's called drought, but I think some of that is manufactured drought by this sort of capture and removal of water that would have otherwise gone into the system.
Yeah,
Ben might want to speak to that too.
Yeah, I mean, one of the difficulties I think with this whole subject is, unfortunately, the Northeast British Columbia is a long, long ways away for most people, and they never get there, so they never see how this is playing out on the ground. And there is a significant portion of the Montney region where all of the development really is focused now. In the south, the southern portion of the Montney, which also happens to have the greatest valued natural gas assets because those assets have a lot of liquids in them, all of that or much of that overlays agricultural land. So clearly there is competition for water on those agricultural lands. But I would also argue that, one of the most significant impacts that the fracking industry is having on the ALR is that the land footprint. So you've got to understand, people have to understand that these multi-well pads are about 20 acres in size. So any one of these pads that is being built on agricultural land is removing 20 acres plus all the associated infrastructure from the agricultural land base. And you're going to have to feed those well pads with all of this water. Now, if the water is captured runoff that's going into dugouts, as Donna just described, that's water that's going to be denied to the hydrological system and potentially to the farmland without question. But I think the bigger issue for farmland is the multitude of impacts that we're seeing, and they are significant. And some of the most sobering interviews that I've had when I've been up in the Northeast have been with farmers and what they're putting up with. It is an incredible stress to these operators, these farming operators.
Yeah, I guess I would just add to that. I don't think people understand this enough, is that for landowners that are impacted by oil and gas, there is very little ability to say no. You might be able to negotiate some compensation for lost access to your land, but if they want to bring a pipeline or a well pad, gas processing plant on your land, they're going to go ahead and do it regardless of whether or not you own it. And I think it really challenges the way we think about private property when you come up with this industry in particular up against landowners. We've got about 10 minutes left, so we're going to try to get to one or two more questions and then we'll wrap up. Elizabeth asks, are the regulations around oil and gas better or in Alberta or British Columbia? This is an interesting question. Ben or Donna, any thoughts on that?
Well, I guess I'm just thinking of, in terms of one of the categories of water, at least they have to be using saline water to get the exemption from the water fees and the licensing requirement and consultation. We don't even have that. So I'd say and then we also have unvested water. Alberta vests all its water. So there isn't an issue of this bulk water transport and the risk of, and the unregulated private sales that who knows what the volumes are and and therefore, what the impacts are. So I can't think of another example, but those are two.
Now, I can speak to the issue of fossil fuel subsidies for fracking wells. BC last year, they announced the cancellation of the deep well royalty credit, which had been one of BC's largest, if not largest, fossil fuel subsidies. It cost taxpayers about $1 billion of lost revenue in 2021. When they updated that system, they removed the old subsidy and added a new one, what they call capital cost recovery. Basically, wells will pay a reduced rate of royalties until they recoup their costs. And privately, people in the ministry talked about that as moving to the Alberta system. So in that case, we were actually catching up with our neighbors in Alberta. There's still a lot of work to be done on that file. Ben, I see a question here about the Blueberry Agreement. In your opinion, did the Blueberry Nation, River Nation Agreement allow more fracking on their territory? And if so, why do you think a nation might consider that?
Well, I mean, I think the situation in the Blueberry Territory is like other First Nations territories in the region. It's a very sad one. As I said at the beginning of my presentation, the much of the damage has already been done. And the agreement, such as we know, is premised on trying to, at least initially, hold the development to those areas that have already been disturbed. And I guess if development is going to be proceeding, that makes sense. But what I was trying to convey in my presentation is that with so much infrastructure, in my view, deliberately being punched in advance of the court's decision, the footprint is already there. So the development is going to happen. Now, on the positive notes on the agreement, much overdue funding is going to be going to the nation that never would have happened had it not been for them taking the brave step of going to court and enduring 7 years of court proceedings before they got what they got. There is a commitment to increase protection of some areas within the traditional territory. Again, that is a good thing. But where I think we need to be focused in terms of what the fracking industry is going to be doing moving forward, and where I think there's a very strong indication that fracking industry is effectively going to get pretty much everything it wanted, is there was no talk after the agreement reached between Blueberry and the provincial government about compensation for the loss of subsurface rights for any company holding rights in the Blueberry traditional territory. Which is a pretty strong indication that companies like Petronas believe that they are going to be able to effectively continue with business somewhat maybe somewhat with some restrictions, but be able to move pretty much freely along the path that they were intending to go. And again, I think that this it's a sad commentary, but it is a result of that industry having relentlessly pushed development in that territory and effectively set the stage for what is now going to unfold.
I would just add to that by saying that, you know, First Nations and Indigenous people in Canada are trapped in a cycle of poverty that is largely a legacy of colonialism and is an ongoing problem in our country. Band councils, who were created by the colonial government, are often struggling to provide their members with basic services, with healthcare and education and access to clean water. And when the only people that come to the table and offer them financial support to help provide those services are industry, those nations feel trapped in that cycle and feel like there isn't another option. So I think if we want to change that dynamic, it's up to all of us to make sure that reconciliation is more than just words, and that Indigenous people get a fair share of the wealth that comes from their traditional territories. I think on that, I'll give everybody a chance if you have a final word to share before we break. Ben, Jill, Donna, is there anything else you want to share with the group that's still with us?
I think I got my chance to rant, but I guess I would just say, just incrementally, I really appreciate that this is going forward and that there will be an opportunity for people to, highlight these issues. But in the meantime, a reasonable expectation of just total transparency, like metering and water volumes and what is really happening out there, would serve, I think, to create even more sort of eye-opening experiences for people, in the sense of Ben's point about, it's far away, we don't see it, but there's a lot happening that even though there's supposed reporting on things like water use, it's not all there.
Ben or Gilles, did you have any final words?
No, I think Stand.earth to have organized this event. I think it's very important that we share information, and I think this is one of the problems, that data is very difficult to access, and in order to make decisions and make good decisions, you need to know. And as Ben, has clearly indicated, it's far away, and the density of population is not very high. If it were happening in the Okanagan or in the Fraser Valley, it would be a completely different situation. So I think we need to push the government, and I think what is happening now with the new energy regulators being funded by the industry and being the one giving authorization and permit, it makes no sense. We should have an institution at arm's length that really look at water. And then I would finish with water. Is water important? Yes or no? If it's yes, then we need to walk the talk. And I think BC has still a lot of work to do. Thank you.
I would concur with what Donna and Jill have said. I think the recent change of name is ominous, and to me signals that the regulation of this industry may be poised to move further down the road of deregulation at a time when we need to be really regulating this industry much more stringently. And I would say, just to amplify on one of the points that Donna made, and that Jill's just mentioned on the regulatory front, we need access to basic information about what this industry is doing, and we do not have that right now. If the wastewater in this industry, as one example, were regulated as a hazardous waste, there would be a requirement that the volumes of hazardous waste being produced are recorded and that public has access to that information. That's the kind of thing, it's nuts and bolts stuff that is needed in terms of some of the regulations that need to be brought in. That would be a very simple one that would give us a lot more understanding about what's going on in this industry. And I just want to say, reiterate my thanks, Sven, to you for organizing this event today.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists and everybody that stuck with us. If you stayed on this call this long, clearly you're very passionate about this issue, and I encourage you all to join us next week for the Fracking BC organizing call. I think we've got a quick poll to see who's interested in coming to that we're going to share, and the link to sign up is in the chat. Thanks again to everybody that joined today and took part, and for all your questions. We're going to continue this discussion and continue organizing around this through Fracking BC and through other ways. So look out for an email in your inbox tomorrow that will have a recording of tonight's presentation and all the links to sign up for anything if you missed them in the chat. Thanks again and have a great night.